The loud screech of tires was followed by an ear-splitting crash that shattered the tranquility of the quiet suburban street. A luxurious black Mercedes S-Class slammed into a streetlight, the front of the car crumpling like paper. Smoke billowed from the hood, and a crowd began to gather, their horrified gasps and frantic murmurs filling the air. "She's still inside," a young man shouted, peering through the shattered windshield. A woman's frail hand dangled lifelessly from the driver's side window, her diamond-studded bracelets glinting in the sunlight. Blood trickled down her forehead, and her head was slumped against the steering wheel. "Call an ambulance! Hurry!" yelled another bystander as a woman in a bright yellow blouse dialed emergency services, her hands trembling. Within minutes, the wail of sirens pierced the air. Paramedics pushed through the crowd, working swiftly to extract the woman from the wreckage. "Mom? Can you hear me?" one of them asked, checking her pulse. She moaned faintly, her lips moving but producing no sound. "She's alive! Get the stretcher!" The crowd watched anxiously as the woman was loaded into the ambulance. Some snapped pictures, recognizing the famous face of Mrs. Elizabeth Coker, one of Lagos' wealthiest socialites, and the wife of a man many whispered about behind closed doors. At the hospital, Elizabeth regained consciousness slowly. The sterile white walls of the emergency room came into focus, and the distant sound of machines beeping reminded her she was alive. A nurse stood by her side, adjusting the IV drip connected to her arm. "Where am I?" Elizabeth croaked, her voice barely audible. "You're at St. Raphael's Hospital, ma'am," the nurse replied gently. "You were in a car accident, but you're stable now. The doctor will be here shortly." Elizabeth's thoughts immediately went to her husband, David. Was he here? Had anyone called him? She sighed bitterly, knowing the man she had devoted her life to would likely show up just for appearances. Moments later, Dr. Adebanjo, a middle-aged man with a kind face and silver-rimmed glasses, entered the room. "Mrs. Coker, I'm Dr. Adebanjo. How are you feeling?" he asked, pulling up a chair beside her. "I've been better," she said weakly. "But I need your help with something." The doctor raised an eyebrow. "Of course, ma'am. What do you need?" Elizabeth took a deep breath. "I need you to help me disappear." Dr. Adebanjo blinked, taken aback. "Excuse me?" "I want you to fake my death," Elizabeth said, her voice steady now. "Tell my family I didn't make it. I'll pay you handsomely, whatever amount you want." The doctor leaned back, clearly uncomfortable. "Mrs. Coker, I don't think you understand what you're asking. This is highly unethical, not to mention illegal." Elizabeth's expression hardened. "I understand perfectly. My life has been nothing but sacrifice for a man who doesn't deserve it. This is my chance to start over. To be free." Dr. Adebanjo hesitated, the weight of her request sinking in. "I need to think about this, Mrs. Coker. What you're asking could ruin my career. And what I'm offering could set you up for life," she countered. "Please, doctor, I'm begging you." He studied her face, seeing both desperation and determination in her eyes. After a long pause, he nodded reluctantly. "All right, but this has to be done carefully." Later that evening, Elizabeth's hospital room was dimly lit when Dr. Adebanjo returned. In his hands was a clipboard containing her falsified death certificate. "Everything's ready," he said quietly. "I've informed your family that you passed away during surgery. They'll come to claim the body in the morning, but you'll be gone by then." Elizabeth exhaled in relief. "Thank you, doctor. You won't regret this." "I already do," he muttered under his breath. "Now, listen carefully. You'll leave tonight through the service exit. A private ambulance will take you to a safe house I've arranged. From there, you're on your own." Elizabeth nodded, her mind racing with the possibilities of her new life. Just then, the door burst open, and David walked in, his face a mix of worry and anger. "Elizabeth," he exclaimed, rushing to her side. "Thank God you're okay. I came as soon as I heard." She forced a weak smile. "David, I didn't think you'd come." "Of course I came," he said, brushing her hair aside. "You're my wife. What would I do without you?" She bit her tongue, resisting the urge to remind him of his laziness and how he had leeched off her wealth for years. Instead, she whispered, "I need to rest." David nodded, leaning down to kiss her forehead. "I'll be back in the morning." When he left, Elizabeth turned to Dr. Adebanjo. "Let's do this." By midnight, Elizabeth was wheeled out of the hospital in a body bag, loaded into the private ambulance waiting at the service exit. Inside the ambulance, she unzipped the bag and sat up, taking a deep breath. "This is it," she whispered to herself. A new beginning. As the ambulance sped off into the night, Elizabeth left behind her old life, determined to rebuild one free of the chains of her past. The small apartment in Kaduna was a stark contrast to the opulence Elizabeth had grown accustomed to. The walls were bare, painted a dull cream, and the single ceiling fan creaked as it spun lazily overhead. The hum of distant motorcycles and the chatter of neighbors seeped through the thin walls, a constant reminder of how far she had fallen, or risen, depending on how she chose to see it. Elizabeth sat at a modest wooden table, her plate of jollof rice and grilled fish half-eaten. She stabbed a piece of fish absent-mindedly, her appetite dulled by the flood of memories that came rushing back. Years ago, David had been charming, his smooth words a balm to her then busy and lonely heart. They'd met at an art gallery fundraiser in Lagos, where he had approached her with a confident stride and a wide smile. "You're too beautiful to be standing alone," he had said, his deep voice laced with a honeyed charm. Elizabeth had laughed, taken aback but intrigued. "And you're too bold for a stranger." "I'm not a stranger anymore," he had replied, extending his hand. "David Coker, entrepreneur and your future admirer." Elizabeth chuckled bitterly at the memory, shaking her head. Entrepreneur, my foot. At the time, he was barely scraping by as an underemployed graduate, but he had sold her a dream so convincing that Shed ignored all the warning signs. "Lizzie," David had said one night after they'd been dating for 6 months, "You know I love you, right?" Shed smiled, cradling his face. "I know, and I love you too," he had sighed dramatically, taking her hands in his. "Then I need you to trust me. My business idea, it's going to take off, I just know it. But I need some financial support to get started. Just a little loan, and I promise I'll pay you back." Elizabeth, blinded by love, had written him a check the very next day. She hadn't hesitated, convinced that his ambition matched his words. When her parents expressed concerns, especially her father, who was always cautious with his finances, David had manipulated her into breaking ties. "You know why they don't like me?" David had whispered one evening as they lay in bed. "It's because they can't control me like they control you." Elizabeth had frowned. "That's not true, David. My parents just want the best for me." "They don't want the best for you," he had countered sharply. "They want to keep you under their thumb, but you're stronger than that. You don't need them. You have me." His words had wormed their way into her mind, sowing seeds of doubt about her family's intentions. Slowly, she had stopped visiting her parents and ignored her friends' calls. David became her entire world, a decision she now regretted bitterly. Elizabeth sighed, pushing her plate aside. Her appetite was gone entirely. She leaned back in her chair, staring at the dim light bulb hanging from the ceiling. How had she been so blind? David had used her love as a weapon, molding her into someone she no longer recognized. She remembered how he had promised to get a good job once they were married. "Just give me time," Lizzie had said, lounging on the couch while she rushed to prepare for work. "Once the business takes off, you won't even need to work anymore." But that day never came. Instead, David had grown lazier, his promises evaporating like morning dew under the harsh sunlight of reality. While she worked tirelessly to maintain their lifestyle, he spent his days watching TV or playing video games. The final straw had been when she discovered he had been taking money from her bank account without her permission. A knock at the door jolted Elizabeth out of her thoughts. She stood cautiously, peering through the peephole. It was her landlord, a middle-aged woman with a kind face. "Good evening, Madam Rahila," Elizabeth said, opening the door. "Good evening, my dear," Rahila replied. "Just checking in to see if you're settling well. Do you need anything?" Elizabeth smiled faintly. "No, thank you. I'm fine." Rahila nodded, her eyes soft with concern. "All right then. Good night." As Elizabeth closed the door, she leaned against it, a wave of loneliness washing over her. For all her wealth and sacrifice, she had ended up here, alone in a tiny apartment with nothing but memories to keep her company. But as the silence enveloped her, she reminded herself why she had made this choice. This was her chance to rebuild, to live for herself for once. And no matter how hard the road ahead would be, she was determined to walk it. Elizabeth had always prided herself on her ability to read people, but when it came to David, she had been completely blind. It wasn't until she stumbled upon the truth that the facade shattered, leaving her with a deep sense of betrayal and rage. It had started innocently enough on a humid Tuesday afternoon. She had taken an unexpected half-day off from work, deciding to surprise David with his favorite dish, pounded yam and a goosey soup. Arriving home, she noticed the eerie silence in the house. Usually, their housemaid Eno would be bustling about, tidying up or humming a local tune. But today the air felt heavy, almost too quiet. Elizabeth stepped inside, balancing shopping bags in her hands, and heard faint voices coming from the living room. She froze, her ears straining to pick up the conversation. "Are you sure she'll fall for it?" Eno's voice drifted out, her tone both conspiratorial and nervous. David chuckled. "Lizzie's a fool, Eno. She trusts me too much. The woman would hand me her life savings if I asked." Elizabeth's heart raced. She pressed herself against the wall, inching closer to the doorway. "And once we get her to sign those papers?" Eno asked, her voice trembling slightly. David's reply was cold, devoid of any affection. "Well, finish her off. An accident, maybe. Poison. It doesn't matter, as long as she's out of the way. Once she's gone, her money is ours, and we'll start a new life. Just you and me." Elizabeth's breath caught in her throat. She clapped a hand over her mouth, her knees threatening to give way beneath her. Her husband, the man she had sacrificed everything for, was plotting to kill her, and with the housemaid no less. The clinking of glasses pulled her out of her thoughts. Peeking around the corner, she saw David lounging on the couch, a glass of wine in hand, while Eno sat beside him, leaning into his embrace. Her heart twisted as she watched David stroke Eno's cheek, whispering sweet nothings into her ear. "She's clueless," he said, smirking. "It's almost too easy." Eno giggled nervously, but there was a flicker of doubt in her eyes. "What if she finds out?" David's expression darkened. "She won't. And even if she does, it'll be too late. Just stick to the plan, Eno. You'll get your cut." Elizabeth couldn't listen any longer. She backed away quietly, her mind racing. How could this be happening? The man she had loved, trusted, and supported had been betraying her in the worst possible way. That evening, Elizabeth locked herself in her bedroom, her hands trembling as she tried to process what she had overheard. Memories of the past flooded her mind. David's empty promises, his sudden interest in her finances, the subtle changes in Eno's behavior. It all made sense now. A knock on the door startled her. "Lizzie, are you all right?" David called out. "You've been in there for hours." Elizabeth quickly wiped her tears and steadied her voice. "I'm fine, David. Just tired. I think I'll go to bed early." "All right," he replied, his tone dripping with false concern. "Let me know if you need anything." As his footsteps faded, Elizabeth clenched her fists. She knew she couldn't confront him yet. She needed a plan. David and Eno thought she was clueless, and she intended to use that to her advantage. Over the next few days, Elizabeth began gathering evidence. She installed a hidden camera in the living room and another in the kitchen. She combed through David's emails and texts, discovering encrypted conversations with Eno detailing their plans. One evening, while David and Eno thought she was out at a board meeting, she watched the live feed from the hidden camera on her phone. David and Eno were in the kitchen, whispering as they mixed something into a pot of soup. "She'll eat this tonight," David said, handing the spoon to Eno. "Make sure she finishes it. The poison is slow-acting. It'll look like natural causes." Elizabeth's stomach churned, but she forced herself to remain calm. She couldn't afford to act recklessly. That night, when Eno served the poisoned soup, Elizabeth pretended to eat, secretly dumping the contents into the potted plant beside her. "Delicious as always, Eno," she said with a forced smile. Eno and David exchanged a quick glance, their eyes gleaming with anticipation. Elizabeth excused herself shortly after dinner, retreating to her room. She locked the door, her heart pounding, as she stared at her reflection in the mirror. "They think they've won," she whispered to herself, her voice steady with determination. "But they don't know who they're dealing with." Elizabeth had made up her mind. She would turn their betrayal into their downfall, and when the dust settled, she would be the one standing tall. David adjusted his tie in the mirror, smirking at his reflection. Life was finally starting to look up. With Elizabeth gone, he could finally take control of the wealth he felt entitled to. Eno walked up behind him, sliding her arms around his waist. "You think they've finished sorting the bank papers?" she asked, resting her chin on his shoulder. "They will," David replied confidently. "Once the estate is fully transferred to my name, we'll be unstoppable." Eno grinned, but there was unease behind her eyes. Are you sure she's really gone? What if? David spun around, cutting her off. I told you the brakes were cut. The crash was fatal. You saw the news. Elizabeth is gone, and there's no coming back. Now, stop worrying. Despite his reassurances, a shadow of doubt lingered in Eno's mind. Miles away, Elizabeth sat in the dimly lit living room of her small apartment, her laptop open in front of her. She had watched the aftermath of her death unfold from the shadows, gathering every piece of information she could. Now, it was time to strike. Her lawyer, Barrister Maxwell, was a trusted friend and confidant. He had been by her side for years, handling her finances and legal matters with precision. She picked up her phone and dialed his number. Elizabeth, Maxwell answered, his voice tinged with relief. I was starting to worry you'd changed your mind. I never back out of a plan, she said firmly. Is everything ready? Yes, he replied. I've already frozen the joint accounts and initiated the transfer of all your assets to the trust we set up. By tomorrow morning, David won't have access to a single kobo. Elizabeth leaned back in her chair, a small smile playing on her lips. Good. That's just the beginning, Maxwell hesitated. Are you sure about this, Liz? This kind of revenge. It's dangerous. Elizabeth's tone hardened. He tried to kill me, Max. He doesn't deserve mercy. He deserves to lose everything. The next morning, David strolled into the bank, a swagger in his step. He approached the teller, sliding a withdrawal slip across the counter. Good morning, sir, the teller said politely. She typed a few keys, then frowned at her screen. I'm sorry, Mr. Coker, but this account has been frozen. David's smile faltered. Frozen? That's impossible. Check again. The teller nodded, trying once more. I'm sorry, sir, but the account is restricted. You'll need to speak with your lawyer for more information. Anger boiled under David's skin. He snatched the slip off the counter and stormed out, his mind racing. When he returned home, he slammed the door shut, startling Eno. What's wrong? She asked. The accounts, he growled. They're frozen, every single one of them. Eno paled. What? How is that possible? David paced the living room, his fists clenched. I don't know, but someone's playing games. I need to call the bank manager. Meanwhile, Elizabeth sat with Maxwell in his office, reviewing the next phase of her plan. David is going to try everything to regain access, Maxwell warned. But as long as the trust remains intact, he won't be able to touch a single naira. Good, Elizabeth said, her voice icy. Let him squirm. Let him feel the weight of what he's done. Maxwell studied her for a moment. You're different, Liz. The old you would have been too kind-hearted for this. Elizabeth met his gaze, her eyes cold. The old me died in that crash. This is survival, Max. And I won't stop until David pays for every lie, every betrayal. By the end of the week, David's frustration had reached a boiling point. He sat in his dimly lit office, surrounded by piles of unpaid bills and foreclosure notices. We need a new plan, Eno said, her voice trembling. David glared at her. A new plan? Do you think this is a game? Everything is falling apart. Eno shrank back, but her fear quickly turned to suspicion. What if she's not dead? David froze, her words hanging in the air like a noose tightening around his neck. That's impossible, he said, though his voice wavered. We made sure. Then how do you explain all of this? Eno interrupted. The accounts, the legal documents, it's like she's still pulling the strings. David slammed his fist on the table. If she's alive, I'll find her. And when I do. He didn't finish the sentence, but the threat was clear. Elizabeth, watching from a distance, knew she had only begun to unravel David's carefully constructed world. The brakes might have failed that day, but so had their plans to destroy her. Now it was her turn to strike, and she wouldn't stop until David and Eno's betrayal cost them everything. Elizabeth leaned back in her chair, sipping tea as she scrolled through the photos and documents Maxwell had helped her retrieve. She had every piece of evidence she needed. David's messages to Eno, Eno's flirtations with other men, and their careless habits of mingling with other lovers. It was time to stir the pot. Let's see how loyal you both are when the truth comes out, Elizabeth muttered to herself, her lips curling into a smirk. She tapped her phone, dialing Maxwell. Max, I need you to deliver some packages for me, she said, and make sure they're sent anonymously. Consider it done, Maxwell replied. What's the target this time? Elizabeth's smile deepened. They're other lovers. Let's see how they handle betrayal from all sides. The following morning, chaos began to unfold. At a modest cafe in Abuja, David's mistress, Clara, sat sipping her coffee when a brown envelope was placed on her table by a courier. "What's this?" she asked, puzzled. The courier simply shrugged and walked away. Curious, Clara opened the envelope to find pictures of David with Eno, along with screenshots of their flirty messages. Her face turned beet red, her hands trembling as she read the conversations. "David, can't wait to see you tonight. Lizzie will be at work as usual. Eno, don't forget to bring that money you promised me. I need to buy something nice for myself." Clara slammed the envelope shut, fuming. "That lying bastard," she hissed, grabbing her phone. At the same time, another envelope landed in the hands of Eno's secret lover, a local shop owner named Musa. He opened it to find damning evidence of Eno's relationship with David, including photos of the two kissing in the kitchen and a bank transfer receipt David had made in Eno's name. Musa's nostrils flared as he read the accompanying note. "She's playing you, Musa, just like she played me." By noon, the storm had reached its peak. David was seated at home, furiously drafting letters to regain control of his finances, when his phone buzzed incessantly. "What now?" he grumbled, answering the call. "David!" Clara's shrill voice erupted from the other end. "You cheating, two-faced dog! How dare you lie to me about Eno being just a housemaid?" David blinked, stunned. "Clara, what are you talking about?" "Don't play dumb with me," she snapped. "I have the proof right here. All your sweet words, your promises, you're nothing but a fraud." Before David could respond, the call ended and another one came through. This time it was Eno. "David, we have a problem," she whispered urgently. "Oh, I'm well aware," he barked. "Clara just called me, screaming about some photos. Care to explain how this mess started?" "It's not just Clara," Eno said, her voice shaking. "Musa found out too. He showed up at the house this morning demanding answers." "What?" David shouted, slamming his fist on the table. By the afternoon, Clara stormed into David's house, trailed by Musa, who had followed Eno home. The two erupted into a heated argument in the living room. "You think you can fool all of us?" Clara screamed, pointing a finger at David. "You've been using me to fund your lifestyle while shacking up with her." "And you," Musa growled, turning to Eno. "I gave you everything, and this is how you repay me? Sneaking around with this idiot?" Eno tried to defend herself, but her words were drowned out by the escalating chaos. David attempted to intervene, but his efforts only fueled the fire. "This is a misunderstanding," he insisted, holding up his hands. Clara laughed bitterly. "Misunderstanding? You're caught red-handed, David. There's no talking your way out of this." Outside, Elizabeth sat in her car, watching the commotion unfold through binoculars. She couldn't help but chuckle as she saw Musa storm out of the house, Clara in tow, both swearing they'd never speak to David or Eno again. "Looks like the web is unraveling," she murmured. She pulled out her phone and sent a message to Maxwell. "Phase 2 complete. On to the next." Maxwell's reply came swiftly. "You're relentless, Liz. Remind me never to cross you." Elizabeth smiled, the satisfaction of her plan taking root deep in her chest. This was just the beginning. David and Eno had thought they could betray her, but now they were learning what it felt like to be on the losing side. David sat in his cluttered study, pacing back and forth as he rubbed his temples. The commotion with Clara and Musa had left him rattled, but there was no time to dwell on it. His financial situation was dire, and he needed money. Fast. "If Elizabeth's assets are locked up, I'll find other ways to fund myself," he muttered, pulling out his phone. He scrolled through his contacts, landing on the names of Elizabeth's former business associates, powerful men and women who had worked closely with her over the years. She trusted them, he thought, smirking. And now they'll trust me. The next morning, David was dressed in his sharpest suit, heading to a meeting with Mrs. Vivian Okafor, one of Elizabeth's most influential partners in her real estate business. He had spun a convincing story on the phone, claiming Elizabeth had left him in charge while she was away on personal matters. Vivian welcomed him into her luxurious office with a polite smile. "David, it's been a while," she said, gesturing for him to sit. "I must admit, I was surprised by your call." David gave a charming laugh. "I understand, Vivian. Elizabeth always handled everything herself, but with her absence, she's entrusted me to keep things running smoothly." Vivian raised an eyebrow. "Absence? I thought she was—" David quickly interrupted. "She's fine, but she's taking some time off to focus on her health. I'm stepping in to ensure her projects stay on track." Vivian nodded, though her expression was skeptical. All right, so what can I do for you? I need an urgent loan, David said smoothly. Just a temporary measure to finalize a few deals. Once Elizabeth returns, everything will be reimbursed. Vivian studied him, her lips pursed. Let me think about it. I'll get back to you. Later that day, Vivian picked up her phone and dialed Elizabeth's lawyer, Maxwell. Hello, Barrister Maxwell? Yes, this is Maxwell. How can I help you, Mrs. Okafor? It's about David Coker. He approached me today, claiming Elizabeth left him in charge of her affairs. Is that true? Maxwell's voice hardened. Absolutely not. Elizabeth has cut all ties with David. Whatever he's told you is a lie. Vivian frowned. I suspected as much. Thank you for clarifying. After hanging up, Vivian sent a quick email to her network of business associates, warning them about David's attempts to solicit funds. Back in her apartment in Kaduna, Elizabeth received a call from Maxwell. Liz, we have a problem, Maxwell began. What now? She asked, though her tone remained calm. David has been contacting your business partners, trying to fund himself by claiming you left him in charge. Elizabeth's jaw tightened. I should have known he'd stoop this low. Maxwell continued, I've already reached out to Mrs. Okafor, and she's spreading the word, but you need to make a statement to put an end to this. Elizabeth nodded, formulating a plan. Draft a letter on my behalf. I want it sent to every associate, investor, and partner I've ever worked with. Make it clear that David has no authority over my businesses. Consider it done, Maxwell replied. The next day, David found himself locked out of every meeting he had scheduled. Calls went unanswered. Emails were ignored. And even his closest allies in Elizabeth's circle refused to meet with him. Frustrated, he barged into the office of one of her longtime investors, Mr. Adewale, only to be stopped by security. Sir, you're not allowed inside, the guard said firmly. David sneered. Do you know who I am? Yes, and we were instructed to deny you access, the guard replied. Please leave. Fuming, David stormed back to his car. His phone buzzed with a notification, and he opened it to find an email from Elizabeth's office. To whom it may concern, this is to formally notify all associates and partners of Elizabeth Coker that David Coker has no authority to act on her behalf. Any dealings with him will not be recognized by Mrs. Coker or her legal representatives. Sincerely, Barrister Maxwell. David's hands trembled as he read the email. She's cutting me off from everything, he muttered. At her apartment, Elizabeth watched the fallout with grim satisfaction. Maxwell had sent her updates throughout the day, detailing how David's attempts to secure funding had been thwarted at every turn. Thank you, Max, she said over the phone that evening. Don't thank me yet, Maxwell replied. You've only just started. What's next on your agenda? Elizabeth stared out the window, her mind racing with possibilities. Next, she said, her voice cold and determined, I'm going to remind David what it feels like to lose everything, piece by piece. David lounged on the plush leather couch in the mansion's grand living room, nursing a glass of whiskey. The stress of being cut off from Elizabeth's associates gnawed at him, but the comfort of the mansion kept him at ease. This is temporary, he muttered to himself, swirling the amber liquid in his glass. I'll figure something out. His thoughts were interrupted by a sharp knock on the door. Moments later, the housekeeper entered, her face pale. Sir, there are men outside, she said hesitantly. They said they're here about the house. David frowned. What men? What are you talking about? Before she could answer, a suited man stepped into the foyer, flanked by 2 security guards. Mr. Coker, the man said briskly, I'm here on behalf of the new owner of this property. You're required to vacate the premises immediately. David shot to his feet, the glass tumbling from his hand and shattering on the floor. What nonsense is this? New owner? This is my house. The man held up a folder containing documents. Not anymore. Mrs. Elizabeth Coker has sold the property and the new owner has taken possession as of today. You were notified in the sale agreement. Notified? David roared. This is a mistake. I didn't agree to anything. The man's expression didn't waver. Mrs. Coker was the sole owner of this property. Her decision is final. You have 24 hours to remove your belongings. David stood frozen, rage boiling inside him. That witch, he growled under his breath. By the next day, David was forced to move out. With nowhere else to go, he packed his belongings into a borrowed truck and drove to Enos' modest apartment on the outskirts of the city. As soon as he stepped through the door, Eno eyed him with thinly veiled irritation. "You actually came," she said, arms crossed. "I thought you'd find another sugar mommy to take care of you." David's jaw tightened. "This is temporary," he snapped. "Don't get comfortable." Eno smirked, stepping aside to let him in. "Temporary or not, you're under my roof now, and in my house, we do things my way." Within days, the reality of living with Eno began to sink in. Her small, two-bedroom apartment was a far cry from the sprawling mansion he had grown accustomed to. The place was cramped, the furniture was mismatched, and the air was always heavy with the scent of cheap air freshener. "Eno, where's breakfast?" David asked one morning, sitting at the dining table. Eno emerged from the kitchen, her hands on her hips. "Do I look like your housemaid? If you're hungry, go cook something yourself." David scowled. "I didn't move in here to be treated like this. And I didn't let you move in to turn me into your servant," she shot back. "You're lucky I even agreed to let you stay." The days turned into weeks, and Enos' attitude grew more domineering. She constantly reminded David of his fall from grace, taking every opportunity to belittle him. "David, pick up after yourself," she barked one evening as he left his shoes in the living room. "I'm not a child, Eno," he retorted. "Then stop acting like one," she snapped. The breaking point came one rainy night. David sat on the worn-out couch, staring at the peeling paint on the walls. The television played softly in the background, but he wasn't paying attention. "Why don't you get a job?" Eno's voice cut through the silence. David looked up, startled. "What did you say?" "You heard me," she said, leaning against the doorframe. "Instead of sitting around all day, sulking, why don't you get off your lazy behind and earn some money?" David's face darkened. "You have no right to talk to me like that." Eno laughed, a cold, mocking sound. "Oh, please. You're broke, homeless, and completely useless. If it weren't for me, you'd be sleeping on the street. So yes, I have every right." Her words hit him like a slap to the face. David stormed out of the apartment, slamming the door behind him. He wandered the streets aimlessly, rain soaking through his clothes as Enos' words replayed in his mind. Back at her apartment in Kaduna, Elizabeth received an update from Maxwell. "David's hit rock bottom," Maxwell reported. "He's living with Eno now, and from what I hear, she's making his life miserable." Elizabeth smiled faintly, though there was no joy in it. "Good," she said softly. "Let him taste the bitterness of betrayal. It's only fair." But deep down, she knew this was just the beginning. David had taken everything from her, and she wasn't done taking it all back. David stood outside a corporate office building, drenched in sweat despite the early morning chill. He clutched a folder containing copies of his resume and reference letters, though he knew deep down they wouldn't be enough. The receptionist glanced at him with thinly veiled disdain as he approached the desk. "Good morning," he said, forcing a smile. "I'm here for the job interview." She looked him over, her gaze lingering on his rumpled suit, which had clearly seen better days. "Do you have an appointment?" "Yes, 10 a.m., David replied confidently. She picked up the phone, murmured something, and hung up moments later. "Mr. David Coker?" "That's correct. I'm sorry, but the position has already been filled," she said curtly. David's stomach dropped. "Filled? But I was told—" "Thank you for coming," she cut in, her tone dismissive. Dejected, David left the building and slumped onto a nearby bench. This was the third rejection in 2 weeks, and he couldn't shake the feeling that Elizabeth's influence had something to do with it. Later that day, David sat in a small restaurant nursing a cup of watery tea. His phone buzzed with a notification, and he opened it to find a bank alert. His account balance was nearly empty. "I can't keep living like this," he muttered to himself. Desperation drove him to the market the next day. It was bustling with activity, traders shouting over one another, customers haggling, and the heavy scent of spices and sweat hanging in the air. A group of wheelbarrow pushers stood near the entrance, waiting for customers to hire them. David hesitated for a moment, his pride warring with his need to survive. Finally, he approached an older man leaning against a rusty wheelbarrow. "Is there room for one more?" David asked quietly. The man sized him up and chuckled. "You? You don't look like you can handle this kind of work." "I can," David insisted. "I just need a chance." The man shrugged and gestured to an empty wheelbarrow. "It's yours if you can manage it." By midday, David's arms and back ached from hauling heavy loads of yams, rice, and other goods across the crowded market. The sun beat down mercilessly, and his once pristine hands were now blistered and filthy. Move faster, a customer barked as David struggled to push a load uphill. He gritted his teeth, sweat pouring down his face, and kept moving. When David returned to Ina's apartment that evening, exhaustion weighed heavily on him. He dropped his earnings, a paltry sum, on the kitchen counter and sank into a chair. Ina walked in, her expression sour. "That's it," she sneered, picking up the money. "It's all I could make today," David replied wearily. "This won't even cover groceries," she snapped, throwing the cash back at him. "You're useless." David's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. The days turned into weeks, and David's situation only worsened. Every morning he dragged himself to the market, enduring the grueling work and the mocking laughter of his fellow wheelbarrow pushers, who relished in his fall from grace. "Big man, David, how the mighty have fallen," one of them jeered one afternoon. "You used to wear suits, now you're wearing rags." David ignored them, focusing on his work, but the humiliation gnawed at him. At home, things were no better. Ina's mockery had turned into occasional slaps and shoves when she was particularly angry. One evening, after a heated argument about money, she threw a plate at him, narrowly missing his head. "You're nothing but a burden," she screamed. "I should have never let you move in." David clenched his fists, anger bubbling beneath the surface, but he didn't dare retaliate. Meanwhile, Elizabeth received regular updates on David's downfall. Maxwell had informed her about his new job at the market, and she couldn't help but feel a mixture of satisfaction and pity. "He's learning what it means to struggle," she said to herself one evening, sitting by her window. But this is only the beginning. She knew she couldn't let her emotions get in the way of her plans. David had taken everything from her, and it was time to make sure he never recovered. As she stared into the night, Elizabeth began crafting the next phase of her revenge, a move that would ensure David was left with nothing, not even his dignity. The bustling marketplace was alive with its usual chaos, traders hawking their goods, children darting between stalls, and the hum of haggling voices filling the air. Suddenly, a piercing scream shattered the routine. "Thief! Thief! Someone stop him!" A woman stood near a jewelry stall, clutching her purse and pointing a trembling finger at David. A small crowd began to gather as two market guards grabbed him, forcing him to empty his pockets. From his tattered trousers, they pulled out a small gold ring and a smartphone. The woman gasped. "That's my phone and my ring! I knew it, you filthy thief!" David stumbled over his words. "It's not what it looks like. Save it!" one of the guards barked, shoving him forward. The crowd jeered and hurled insults as David was marched to a nearby police post. At the station, David sat in a filthy cell, his head in his hands. The stench of sweat and decay filled the air, mingling with the despair of the other inmates. "How did it come to this?" he muttered, his voice cracking. 3 days passed in that hellhole, each moment stretching into an eternity. The guards mocked him, and the other inmates eyed him with suspicion. On the morning of the 4th day, a guard called his name. "Coker, someone's here for you," David frowned. "Someone? Who?" The guard shrugged. "Your bail's been paid. Move." David was escorted to the front desk, where he signed release papers with shaky hands. He looked up, expecting to see Eno or one of his few remaining acquaintances. Instead, standing there was a woman whose elegance took his breath away. She wore a flowing gown of soft gold, her hair cascading down her back, and her aura exuded confidence. For a moment, David couldn't breathe. "Elizabeth," he whispered, his voice barely audible. The woman turned to him, her eyes narrowing. She looked him over, her gaze lingering on his gaunt face, unkempt hair, and the tattered clothes hanging off his frame. "I don't believe we've met," she said coolly, her tone devoid of recognition. David's heart sank. The love of his life, the woman he had betrayed and taken for granted, didn't even recognize him anymore. Elizabeth turned to the officer at the desk. "Is that all?" "Yes, ma'am," the officer replied. Elizabeth nodded and turned to leave. As she walked away, David staggered forward, his legs trembling. "Lizzie, wait," he called out. She stopped, but didn't turn around. "Lizzie?" she repeated, her tone tinged with amusement. "I haven't gone by that name in years. You must have me mistaken for someone else." David fell to his knees. "Elizabeth, please, it's me, David. Don't leave me like this." She finally turned, her expression calm but cold. "I gave you everything," she said softly, "and you destroyed it all. Now, you're nothing but a stranger to me." With that, she walked out of the station, her heels clicking against the floor, as she disappeared into the sunlight. David stood there, frozen, as her words echoed in his mind. He stumbled out of the station, looking around for her, but she was gone. As he wandered the streets aimlessly, the weight of his actions bore down on him. Elizabeth had become everything he had once promised to help her be: strong, independent, and untouchable. Meanwhile, he was a broken man, abandoned by everyone he had once manipulated. Across town, Elizabeth sat in her sleek car, watching as David disappeared into the distance. Maxwell, seated beside her, glanced at her cautiously. "Do you feel better now?" he asked. Elizabeth's lips curved into a bittersweet smile. "Justice was served, Maxwell. That's all that matters." She took a deep breath, letting the moment settle. For the first time in years, she felt truly free. As she drove away, she left behind not just David, but the pain and betrayal he had caused. Her new life awaited, and she was ready to embrace it fully.